Chapter 6 could be a whole course. It could be a whole PhD thesis. And the good part is that you already learned it all from anatomy and physiology, except for I imagine you probably didn't really learn it then, at least not as well as I expect you to have learned it. So I'm thinking that you're going to know it much better. You're going to be more familiar with metabolism when you get done with this chapter. The other thing you're going to see as you're reading through, don't let it put you to sleep, because some of it is very familiar. Some of it is you already know from maybe 8th, 9th, 10th grade biology. Some of it for sure, if you've taken A&P 1, you know a good lot of it already. Maybe at least you've heard it before. But I really want you to know it for this class. I expect that you will know it for this class. And so I'm going to go through a little bit quickly. I'm hoping that for you guys we can get done in about a week's time. That's my goal. We'll see if I can speed through. That means you should have already read Chapter 6 once already. So I'm probably not going to talk about everything in Chapter 6 as much as I might if I had a whole semester. But you definitely want to read or reread Chapter 6 by the time we come in Wednesday. So anything that doesn't make sense you can ask questions about before you come in. So you're familiar with metabolism, and one of the big things in metabolism is a lot of things were understood in microbes again. And so way back in the 1800s, we had Pasteur, we had other guys trying to figure out what was going on with the sugars, the carbohydrates, the other things that were being put into solution, and then yeast being added. What was going on, and how did that sugar get converted from sugar to alcohol and gas and other things that are produced in that fermentation process? So one thing that Pasteur did was that he added a few yeast cells. They grew, the sugar decreased, the alcohol level increased, and then there were a larger number of cells in there. And that supported the idea that the yeast were doing this fermentation process. But realize, too, this is not that long ago. It's only about 165 years ago that this was happening, and this was the level of understanding of biology back then. Still not very high level of understanding it. Actually, you remember Pasteur was French. He worked in the wine industry, and so he was a scientist. And the German scientists, they still don't like each other very much, and just the two cultures don't like each other very much. So Pasteur said the yeast is taking the sugar, it's breaking it down, it's making the alcohol, it's spitting the alcohol back out, it's spitting CO2 out. And the Germans basically laughed. They made some funny caricatures that showed up in the newspapers of these big, ferocious yeast cells that were munching the sugar and then spitting out CO2 and alcohol on the other side, and basically made fun of them until this guy, Edward Buchner, a German scientist, actually did a similar type of experiment that Pasteur was trying. He took yeast cells that had been growing, he dried those yeast cells, and then he crushed those yeast cells and killed all the cells. And then he took that yeast extract, those dead cells that had been crushed up, and he put those in a test tube with sugar, and he saw that what came out of those cells could actually do the processes that was being described. They could take the sugar and they could convert the sugar into alcohol and to carbon dioxide. He actually ended up winning the Nobel Prize in 1907 for identifying that process. And so again, just keep in mind that even though this stuff is common knowledge to you, it's not that long ago that the processes really weren't understood well. So you guys know that metabolism is important. There's two parts to metabolism. Metabolism does two essential things, and you guys are doing it while you're sitting there, even though your brain may not be doing it as highly as I would like for it to. The rest of your body is doing it. If you ate breakfast, your brain is doing two things. It's breaking down that breakfast, and it's harvesting energy out of the breakfast that you ate. You know that because every time you get hungry and start to turn surly, you know that you need to reach for a Snickers bar, or at least the commercials tell you that's what you should reach for. And so you need that Snickers bar so you can get some more energy so you won't be as surly with your friends. You need it for another reason as well. You need that Snickers bar or whatever you eat so that you can get building blocks to build up those macromolecules that we talked about in Chapter 2. The proteins, the lipids, the other carbohydrates, the nucleic acids, and all of those building blocks that cells need to be able to grow. So that's the two fundamental parts of metabolism. Breaking down things that have energy in them, harvesting that energy so you can use that energy and some of those products from the breakdown to build up macromolecules for the cell. And we call that whole process metabolism. There are lots of important implications for us as humans, and one is making a biofilm. That 10% gas, if you've got or 10% ethanol in your gas, if you've got a normal vehicle, or that, I guess it's E80, the 80% gas, if you've got one of those vehicles that can use the 80% alcohol fuel products that we've got out there now. That alcohol, a lot of it is produced by microorganisms that take the corn, the sugar that's in corn, and ferment it and produce the alcohol. There are other ways to do it, but a lot of it's done that way. You also know that we use fermentation in the production of food. Fermentation and the metabolism processes are important in the laboratory. And they're really important because we can use metabolism in microorganisms to understand what's going on inside of our bodies. We can figure out what's going on. In fact, almost everything you learned in anatomy and physiology and any other biology class was first understood in a microorganism. And then they said, hey, let's look at our cells and see how they do it. And our cells are more complex, so it's a little bit harder, but those microorganisms are useful as models to study what's going on down inside of our body. And the other thing you're going to see as we go through this chapter, there's a lot of diversity in microorganisms. Microorganisms do metabolism in so many different ways that our cells don't. So look for those diversities, because when you read through this chapter, the diversities are probably the parts that are going to trick you up on an exam, because you're not used to seeing cells being able to do things those ways. So look for the diversities as you're going through this chapter and understand those diversities, so that when you take the exam, you're not just thinking about how your cells do it, what you learned in anatomy and physiology, but how other microorganisms do it. And because there is so much diversity, that diversity provides beautiful potential drug targets. Remember, I told you earlier that when we want to develop drugs that can deal with microorganisms, the first thing that we need to do, the easiest way to kill them, is to find a way that they do a process that our cells don't do. And we'll talk about some of those pretty shortly here. So if we can find something that microorganisms have to do, or viruses have to do, that our cells don't do, and now there's an enzyme that our cells don't have, if we can figure out a chemical that very specifically interacts with those enzymes, we can potentially block the growth and kill those organisms by blocking those specific proteins. So that's a beautiful way, and that's the way most drug development happens. I think I talked to you about crowdsourcing with HIV, trying to figure out the structure of a protein that's important to the HIV life cycle. And that's exactly what they were trying to do, was to look and see what the structure of that protein was, so that they could develop a chemical that would specifically interact with that protein. Our cells don't have any protein that's anything like that protein, and so the potential cross-reactivity with our cell function is relatively low if we can develop specific chemicals that are that way. So we have two parts of metabolism. One is catabolism, and the other is anabolism. You guys know that all the time professional athletes are getting charged in court with using anabolic steroids, chemicals that have been described as illegal based on their specific profession. You guys could use them and not probably have any charges brought against you, but in their professions, they can be charged with using those anabolic steroids. So why would they use anabolic steroids? It's illegal. What are they hoping to gain from using those anabolic steroids? They're wanting to get more muscle mass, maybe quicker muscle mass, bigger, stronger, faster, more powerful, able to leap tall buildings with a single bound, that kind of thing. So that's what they're wanting to do. So what does anabolism mean? How would you describe anabolism in simple terms? Building up something. In the case of those anabolic steroids and the professional athletes that are using, my son plays high school sports. He says even some of the guys on the high school teams are using anabolic steroids to try to get faster and stronger. And so he doesn't, but apparently some of those guys do. So anabolism is building up things, hopefully getting stronger, faster, more powerful muscles. And so we call that biosynthesis. Biosynthesis is building up molecules. So if you go back to chapter 2 tonight, which I know you're going to do, and look at chapter 2, you got a whole bunch of biosynthesis. If you think about all those macromolecules that we looked at in chapter 2, they're all built through anabolism. They're all built through anabolic metabolism. Okay? And basically that means taking subunits and assembling them into macromolecules. So if we go back up to catabolism, the other side of metabolism, couple of things happen. We release energy. The cell can then capture that energy and use that energy to recharge ADP to make ATP. That's one of the important processes that happens out of catabolic metabolism. The other thing that happens, you already know, when you take glucose into your cells and it gets broken down into pyruvate, what do you get out of that process? And what is that process called? Taking glucose and breaking it down through a series of about 7-8 steps into pyruvate. Glycolysis, right? Glycolysis. It literally means the lysis or the breakdown of glucose, glycolysis, okay? And you know that then the pyruvate can either go into the intermediate step and then the TCA cycle, or the pyruvate, do you know what else it can be used for? Anabolism. What kind of anabolism?
Making proteins.
Beautiful. Pyruvate can actually be converted into about 5-6 different amino acids if the cell has the ability. Your cells can't make all of those, but E. coli can, and many bacteria can, yeast can. And so you can take the pyruvate, you can convert it into amino acids that would then be strung together to make what? Proteins, right? And that's anabolic metabolism. That's anabolism that we're talking about right there. So the building blocks for anabolism also come out of catabolism. Based on what I just said, there are two things that come out of catabolism. What are those? Two things that come out of catabolic metabolism. What are they? ATP and those subunits all come out of catabolism. Right? All right, good. And anabolism uses both of those things. And anabolic metabolism, stringing all those monomers together to make those macromolecules, uses energy, and it needs those subunits to be able to do it. So building up proteins, lipids, other carbohydrates, DNA, peptidoglycan, LPS, all of those things that we've talked about need energy to glue them together, and they need the building blocks, those subunits that are going to be strung together to do that. Question. Let's talk about harvesting energy. Harvesting energy, you all know that this water over here on this side of the dam has a lot of potential energy, right? When I look at you all, when I look at students, when I see freshmen coming to this campus, and you all too, there's tons of potential energy. Each one of you can become that Einstein or that amazing person in your era, and you've got that potential down inside of you if you capture that potential energy that's down inside of you. You can do it. And the only way it won't happen is if you don't take that potential that's down inside of you and use it to its fullest. If we look at the water that's here on this side of the dam, you know that it's exerting a lot of energy on that dam. And if that dam should crack, and that dam should let the water flow through the crack after the dam fails, then the villages that are down this way will all be destroyed and people will die, right? So that's one way that the potential energy could be released as kinetic energy, but that wouldn't be very fruitful. In my mind, that's video gaming, but don't hate me. Okay, my sons, 2 of them, 3 of them, all of them love to play video games. If they ever hear this, they'll know that I'm talking about them. And that's really a waste of potential energy. But if you let that energy flow through a very controlled, a very well-formed opening that's in that dam, as it flows through, down inside of that opening are turbines that are turned by the water as it's flowing through. And that same kinetic energy now is being harvested by those turbines. And as they spin, they're turning an electric motor that's an electric generator. And it's producing energy that then can flow through these wires and power the cities that are off around that dam, and beautiful things happen. And that's like studying in college. So you've got lots of potential energy, and if you use it the right way, beautiful things will happen. If you don't, then less beautiful things may happen. Although, if you move to China, you can make about $1/4 an hour playing video games. And there are guys that live in the video kiosks 24/7, harvesting gold coins that they will then sell to Americans that want those gold coins or tokens for their video games. And they can actually make a better living doing that than they can working out in the community. And so it's an industry. but you have to keep in mind that their lifestyle is a little bit lower than the lifestyle that you all are used to. So probably those gold coins, gold tokens in our society aren't going to give you the lifestyle that you want. So hopefully you'll focus your potential energy and let it go through those kinetic channels that are going to give you the most benefit. So do you guys know the study of kinesiology? Have you heard of that before? What's kinesiology? Study of motion, how the body moves, how the joints work, how the muscles make it work, and all the ways that it should work normally. And they also study abnormal movement because really they're trying to help people improve their movement so they can have less pain in their body and so their bodies can function more effectively and more efficiently. And so that's what this kinetic energy is, and that's where we get the root for kinesiology, to study the process of motion. So most all of the energy that comes into our environment comes from the radiant energy of the sun coming into our environment, and those photons of light and other waveforms that come into our environment reach our Earth, and some of those are absorbed by photosynthetic organisms like you see here. How many of you had a bowl of cereal or a pancake or something like that today when you got up for breakfast? The rest of you are all gluten-free, right? Okay, so if you had anything that had grain in it, then you depended on this process right here. The photons of light coming to Earth and then being absorbed by those photosynthetic organisms that we call photoautotrophs. They make carbohydrates from the CO2 that they fix from the environment, and then we eat them. If you didn't raise your hand and you had breakfast, you probably ate some cute little guy like this little field mouse. One girl in Thursday's class said she had bacon and eggs, and so you're actually eating that guy, which ate the carbohydrates that were produced by that photosynthetic plant. If you ate breakfast this morning, what's happening right now in your body? Your stomach's still gurgling, but as those foods are being broken down, what's actually happening? Metabolism, and we're talking about respiration now. Respiration does what? You remember the main product of respiration? It takes glucose and it oxidizes the glucose to what? CO2. Respiration is the release product. And that CO2 that because we're just like this cute little mouse, we're chemoorganoheterotrophs. We're breaking down carbon-containing molecules and releasing CO2 into the environment. And that CO2 then is used by these autotrophs, again, to make more photosynthetic processes. So life as we know it depends on those processes to occur. Inside of any chemical, there's some amount of free energy. Free energy is the amount of energy that's available to do work. Okay? When a chemical reaction happens, there's some chemical reactions, when the reaction occurs, they actually release energy into the environment, and those reactions are called exergonic. Exergonic, when those happen, energy is released. And then there's other reactions that you have to put energy into them, and then when you have to put energy into them, the reaction that requires energy, then those are endergonic. But every chemical reaction has a certain amount of free energy, and you have to look at what's going on in the reactants and the products, which one has the most free energy to determine whether they're endergonic or exergonic. I got about 4 minutes, so let me tell you this story. How many of you drink coffee? Don't lie. All right. How many of you drink your coffee black? How many of you that don't drink it black put some kind of creamer in it, right? Most of us do. How many of you put that powdered creamer in? Yeah, if you have to. If you had half and half, would you put that in instead? Probably not. So my mother-in-law is just like those of you that just shook your head no. Before she passed, she'd come to our house, and she'd stay for a week, 2, or a month, or sometimes longer when she came to our house. And one time she came to visit. She wanted coffee, and I drink coffee, but I almost always drink mine black. And so she got to our house. I wasn't around, and so she saw that we had no coffee creamer, and she didn't like to put milk in her coffee. So she went and got one of those gigantic, good value coffee creamer containers from, I guess, is Walmart that sells good value products. Yeah, she got one of those, and she put it up in the cabinet. She would use a little bit, and every time she came to visit, it was there. It was ready for her. She had her coffee creamer when she came to the house. And how many of you have gone camping before? How many of you have ever been around a campfire before? Even if you didn't go camping, a bonfire of some sort, right? Have you ever done this? Taken that coffee creamer, instead of putting it in your coffee, because some of you kind of scrunched your noses when I suggested that, take the coffee creamer, put it into your hand, and throw it out over the fire. Stand back a little bit. What happens when you do that? It flashes. You hear crackling, you see bright light, and it burns up really, really fast. It releases a lot of energy. Some of it's in the form of heat, some of it's in the form of light, some of it's in the form of sound, and that energy is released really quickly. When you put it in your coffee and drank it, did you feel that same combustion down inside of your stomach? No, you didn't, right? It probably wouldn't be so good for you. In fact, that's why I said before you throw it in, step back a little ways, because I don't want you to ignite your hand and I don't want to get sued. So make sure that you actually don't do that, because I don't want to get sued, even though you probably will now. Go and do that experiment. You got to see it. It's pretty cool. And the point is that coffee creamer has lots of potential energy. The powdered coffee creamer has lots of potential energy. If you read the ingredients, it's almost all lipids and sugar down inside of it. But it's sat, my mother-in-law passed away about 7 years ago, and I probably should clean out the pantry, but it's been sitting up in the pantry for about 10 years, and it has never once exploded inside of my house. And the reason for that is that you have to input energy to get that reaction going. And if you don't input that energy, it won't get going. And so we'll talk about the processes that are involved. And when you eat that or drink that coffee creamer, have you ever eaten it? It actually tastes kind of sweet. You got to try it sometime. It tastes better that way than it does in coffee. And so it tastes kind of like the dehydrated ice cream. But anyway, when you eat it, you slowly release the energy out of it, and your body harvests the energy out of those lipids and out of the sugar that's down inside of there, instead of releasing the energy very, very quickly. So we'll talk about that process when we get back together next time.